Very good morning and good evening to you, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's discussion. This is the third meeting of this new event series that's hosted by CIPE and our partners across Asia-Pacific. And this series is about a topic, and that is mitigating governance gaps and risks in order to enable a better environment for foreign investments. In simpler words, this event is about an important question, and that is how to make large-scale infrastructure investments more transparent and accountable and truly reflective of people's needs and interests. We think this is quite an important question because these projects are funded by financial resources that belong to the people by virtue of being given under their name, of course, and will have a direct impact on their lives. I'm Arya Nujat. I manage CIPE's programs in South Asia and will be moderating today's event in the Q&A session, for which the participants can use the Q&A feature. And I will remind you of that again when we get to the Q&A session. But before I introduce our panelists for today, I would like to walk you through a little background and tell you how exactly we got here and what led to this initiative, the BRI Monitor project. And there are a few slides that my colleague will display shortly. Oh, there they are. Thank you so much. Okay, so if you've been regularly joining the series of events, you would be familiar with the purpose, design, and flow of the series. But for those of us that are joining for the first time, today's event is part of a series of 5 bi-weekly discussions on the findings of the BRI Monitor project. The BRI Monitor, in its current form, is a regional initiative that seeks to advocate for greater transparency and accountability by identifying governance gaps associated with Chinese-funded projects in Southeast Asia. Each event in this series highlights findings from one of the project partners as part of a discussion on transparency and governance with experts on the focus country or the project type. To tell you a little bit about the partners that we have, the 5 partners on the BRI Monitor project are IDEAS in Malaysia, Strat-based Albert del Rosario Institute in the Philippines, the Institute for National Affairs in Papua New Guinea, Future Forum in Cambodia, and Sandhi Governance Institute in Myanmar. And I should also add that the BRI Monitor is an initiative with a global scope, and this series of case studies followed by events that focus on South Asia are part of the first regional pilot of this global initiative. Today, our event will draw on case studies that are conducted by CIPE and our regional partner to analyze the impact of China's digital investments, that is the Digital Silk Road, along the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Specifically, we will look at the security and governance risks of Chinese ICT investments in the Philippines and then draw a comparison with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CIPEC, in Pakistan. Now, a little bit about the Digital Silk Road. I'm sure you're familiar. It was introduced in 2015 by an official Chinese government white paper as a component of the Belt and Road Initiative. And broadly speaking, DSR involves digital trade, which is the exchange of products, services, and technologies that rely on the internet and other digital technologies as a means of transmission. Similar to the BRI, DSR, or the Digital Silk Road, is more like a branding tool for China-based tech firms in the 140 countries that have signed up to the BRI, promoting everything related to telecommunications, data-related business operations, or product sales. Especially with the COVID pandemic, as you would have noticed, many online and contactless services such as e-commerce have soared in usage, creating a bigger space for digital trade to thrive. These conditions have further paved the way for the DSR to become the digital bridge to support all types of global activities, including commodities, services, capital, and logistics. According to official documents, the Digital Silk Road pursues 4 goals. The first goal is to provide assistance to BRI countries in narrowing down their digital gap and speeding up their economic and social development. This assistance has a specific focus, of course, on specific areas, and I will name a few, such as digital economy, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, quantum computer, high-speed internet, and smart city construction. The second goal is to connect the transnational information platform in order to push for the development of the internet industry and digital economy, all in the service of the DSR. The third goal is to set global technical standards informed by Beijing's vision, of course. And the last goal, the fourth goal, is to build a digital governance framework that is suitable for the BRI development. Now, you may be thinking, well, foreign direct investment is generally beneficial, and for emerging economies and democracies in transition, it's a vital source of finance for development. So why pause over Chinese investment at all if it's providing the much needed beneficial financial resources to these countries? You're absolutely right in wondering about this question, but here is one reason why. So in addition to FDI, another important source of capital inflow is through overseas development assistance, ODA. Now, since the 1990s Paris Agreement, most major developed countries under the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, they have tended to follow certain norms and how ODA is administered, for example, by limiting the practice of tie date. However, not all countries are party to this agreement. And one of the countries that has actively resisted following these norms, and you guessed it right, is unfortunately China. In the backdrop of this, back in 2018, a common problem that our partners faced was unavailability of data or inconsistency in available data on governance effects of Chinese FDI and other forms of financing in emerging markets. To try and address this gap in information, CIPE and South Asian partners produced a report, and it's titled Mitigating Governance Risks from Investments in Southeast Asia. This report is available on CIPE's website, and the link to it will be shared with you in the chat momentarily. The findings of this report led to the BRI Monitor project. So what is this BRI Monitor project and what information it provides? The BRI Monitor Asia-Pacific pilot, because I mentioned it's a global initiative and this is an Asia-Pacific pilot of it, it includes descriptive case studies from 5 countries at the moment: Malaysia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Cambodia, and Myanmar. It also includes a transparency heat map that assesses the transparency of BRI projects based on 38 data points that, according to international best practices, should be proactively disclosed by host countries, but that's not what happens generally. Now, how is this transparency assessment of BRI projects useful? It helps identify consistent governance gaps, which then informs the prioritization of policy advocacy in areas where it can do the most immediate good. The results of the transparency assessment for each data point in each case study are presented on BRI Monitor website using a color-coded scale, the heat map, which you can see on your screens at the moment. The more red it is, the more problematic it is, basically. The heat map, which is developed through this project, identifies specific types of information that governments could release to improve their transparency score. The heat map also enables advocates to compare current government procurement procedures against internationally recognized best practices. In looking at the heat map, helps advocates see the red flags more easily, identify gaps that are in need of attention, and highlight elements of the project process that consistently lack transparency across case studies. So basically, it's a tool that empowers advocates and helps governments, if they want it, to be more transparent and share more information. One of the countries featured on this heat map is the Philippines, and this brings us to what we're going to discuss today. The case studies from Philippines, followed by a comparison with Pakistan, which is a major recipient of Chinese investment in South Asia through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CIPEC. To tell us about how these investments are unfolding in recipient countries, we have 2 esteemed panelists with us today. Joining from Manila is Paco Pangalangan, the Executive Director of Stratbase ADR Institute. Paco specializes in political risk analysis, policy development, and strategic communications. And over the last decade has worked with a wide range of sectors, including technology, energy, and public utilities. Paco is also passionate about affecting meaningful change through policy advocacy, which is a line of work that he also engages with in the capacity of the lead convener of Democracy Watch Philippines. And that is a citizen-led initiative that advocates for democratic values in good governance reform. And our second panelist joining us from Islamabad, Pakistan, is Dr. Is Akbar Zaidi, a well-known and well-respected Pakistani political economist, a former Columbia University professor for a decade, and the current president of the Institute of Business Administration, IBA, in Karachi, Pakistan. Dr. Zaidi brings to today's discussion valuable insights informed by nearly 4 decades of teaching and research experience in Pakistan and abroad. And as you would have guessed by now, he has written and published widely, to name a few, on topics such as the political economy of South Asia, military, civil society, and democratization in Pakistan, which is the title of a book published a decade ago in 2011, I think, in Pakistan's Economy, a political economy perspective, that's published by Oxford in 2015. The list of Dr. Zaidi's books and Paco's efforts to support democracy in the Philippines is beyond the scope of today's event, so I will stop at that, but the participants can definitely look into their detailed bio that's available on the event page on CIPE's website. So without further ado, I will now turn to our panelists for their initial remarks, which will be then followed by the Q&A session, and we'll begin with Paco from the Philippines. So Paco, based on the case studies that you have conducted jointly with CIPE, what can you tell us about how these Chinese investments as part of the digital Silk Road are unfolding in the Philippines? What are the means through which those 4 goals of DSR that I mentioned earlier are pursued? And how are those means affecting people's lives? Over to you, Paco.
Thanks so much, Arya. And good afternoon, or where I am, it's good evening. Especially Dr. Zaidi. If it's all right, I actually prepared a few slides and to just guide my short discussion today. Let me just see. Is this working?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Let me just put it into our presentation. There we go. So yeah, so hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. So thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm Paco Pangalangan from the Philippines. I'm the Executive Director of Strat-Based ABR Institute. We're a think tank based out of Metro Manila. And I'm here today to talk to you about a couple of case studies that we've worked with CIPE over some time as part of the BRI Monitor project. So actually when we, I think it was mentioned earlier, we actually had 4 case studies that we conducted. And I think, it just so happened to be an ideal combination of case studies because as you can see, we had 2. The first 2 which were more traditional infrastructure projects. The Chico River Pump Irrigation Project in northern Luzon, and the new Centennial Water Source Kaliwa Dam Project in the east of Metro Manila. And then we have the 2 on the right side of the screen, Dito Telecommunity, which is a telecommunications venture, and Safe Philippines Project, which is a surveillance project and both are being launched nationwide. Let me first tell you about the Dito telecommunity case study that we conducted. So like I said, it's a nationwide project. And I think, given the time that we have today, I'll just really compress the discussion a bit. But yeah, the Dito telecommunity was politicized since the very beginning. President Duterte, when he ran in 2016, used the state of the country's telecommunications sector as a political anchor to win some votes from the Filipino voters. He disregarded a lot of the existing complaints, for example, when it came to the bureaucratic red tape that was slowing down the development in the industry, and instead had a consistent line of attack against the the incumbent telecommunication companies at the time. And of course, this paved the way for Dito Telecommunity. Dito Telecommunity is essentially the third telecommunications company that serves the Philippine market. The controversy really arose when during the bidding process, two of the other bidders were disqualified, and the winning bidder emerged as a businessman named Dennis Uy. Dennis Uy was one of the top campaign donors of President Duterte during his 2016 campaign. And, over the last few years, he's really amassed, a large control over several large businesses. Dito Telecommunity is just one of his ventures. Another that might be familiar is he recently, or his companies recently, took control over a large gas field, formerly owned by Shell. But yeah, I digress a bit. Dito, in addition to Dennis Uy's companies, Udena Corporation, they're in a joint venture with China Telecommunications Corporation. It's one of those 60-40 deals, which is the requirement of Philippine law when it comes to foreign investment in certain sectors. Now, in the interest of time, I've actually combined some of the concerns and some of the issues that both projects that we found in both projects, and I'll get to that later on. At this point, I really just want to talk a little bit about the second case study we conducted, which is on the national surveillance system called Safe Philippines Project. So the Safe Philippines Project is a joint project between the Philippines and the China International Telecommunications Construction Corporation. And essentially what it is that it aims to install 12,000 high-definition CCTV cameras across the country. They've started with Davao, which is the home of President Duterte. It's in Mindanao, and of course in all cities of Metro Manila as well. And they've set up several command centers in the country, and of course the concerns here with the technology that's being implemented through these CCTV surveillance systems, which include facial and vehicle recognition software. So these two projects, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the reason we selected them is because of the involvement or the backing of these Chinese companies or Chinese investment. And a few things that we saw in common in terms of issues and controversies that both Dito Telecommunity and Safe Philippines shared are these three things. First was the flawed and opaque bidding process. So I had mentioned earlier that for Dito Telecommunity, that the two other bidders for the license to operate that third telecommunications network were disqualified. When we're talking about Safe Philippines, it was also quite flawed in the sense that it was explicitly stated in the bidding bulletin that only qualified Chinese contractors could actually bid for the project. The second common issue that they both share are the privacy and national security, cybersecurity risks that they have. A major talking point here in the Philippines is China's intelligence law and how intelligence agencies might use this to force Chinese companies to share data with these intelligence agencies. And of course, there's the transparency and accountability concerns. For example, the undisclosed or delayed publishing of relevant documents that we saw with the Safe Philippines project. So, examples here were the loan agreements and the contractor agreements that weren't released to the public. And of course, when it comes to the telecommunications firm, there were a lot of issues regarding the franchise validity that they had before entering some of these deals. Of course, there's that issue of cronyism and how, such a close ally of the president was able to gain control over this third license. And along the way, there've also been extended deadlines. And this comes in, there were a lot of milestones that this telecommunications company, Tito, was expected to meet as part of its franchise agreement. And when it was close to the deadline and they weren't meeting, it looked like they weren't going to meet those milestones, the deadlines were extended. So a lot of the findings that these case studies found, aren't unique. A lot of other people are seeing this as well. And just to illustrate, I wanted to share some of these headlines from major news media outlets in the Philippines of how Duterte's love affair with China has shaped the Philippine economy, how we've traded our patrimony in for some Chinese investments. And there's a lot of talk about the role of Chinese investment in the Philippines and how it's affecting not just our security, but governance and our economic growth as well. Another impact that this discussion has had is actually even in legislation. There is a pending bill now in the Philippine Senate. It's called the Amendments to the Public Services Act. And what this bill wants to do, what this legislation wants to do, is to open up several industries, several public service industries to larger foreign investment. I had mentioned earlier that there was a 60-40 limit on foreign investment, where foreign companies can only own as much as 40% of certain companies. So this bill seeks to lift that limit and attract more investment. But there is that concern about how this law could affect investments for, let's say, in the telecommunications sector. There are concerns that once this law is passed, that China Telecommunications, Chinatel, which owns 40% of Dito Telecommunications, might increase its control to 100, and how this might pose certain security threats to the Philippines. Okay, and all of this, of course, happens, with the backdrop of these trends and other trends and developments. There's a lot of talk about how the President Duterte's Build program, which is his flagship infrastructure program, has given preferential treatment to Chinese companies. There's also an ongoing discussion on, the West Philippine Sea disputes, and there's major mistrust among Filipinos towards China. In fact, our institute recently conducted a national survey, and we haven't released the results of this survey, but what it found is what surveys before it have found, that the Filipinos trust China the least among these major trading partners. And of course, like I said, that stems from the West Philippine Sea dispute, and it stems from the national security concerns that people have. Of course, another trend and development that is key and we should watch out for as we talk about BRI and Chinese investments, as well as governance and its impact on governance, the 2022 national elections. The Philippines is really ramping up towards the national election in 2022, when it will be electing both national and local officials, including our president and vice president, as well as senators and members of the House of Representatives. And these issues of Chinese investment have the potential of becoming quite a central election issue, and it has and could, or at least we hope that it can shape what happens in May 2022 when Filipinos head to the polls. Definitely, it's an issue that a lot of Filipinos are talking about, and it's one that candidates have had to speak on when it comes to public debate. So I actually wanted to end at that. I really tried to keep it a bit tight. I know that we had some time restrictions, but I do understand that the full case studies will be part of CIPE's newsletter, which will be released in the coming month. So I think more details on the 2 case studies that I've discussed so far will be found there. So thanks so much, Arya. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Paco, for sharing your insights and your findings from the case studies. As you rightly mentioned, the 2 case studies that you discussed today are not yet published, but they will be published and distributed through CIPE's newsletter in the next few weeks, hopefully. I already have a few questions, Paco, for you, but why don't I hold on those till we get to the Q&A session? And for now, I would turn to Dr. Zedi and ask about what comparisons, Dr. Zedi, can we draw between what Paco shared in the case of the Philippines and Pakistan's CIPE experience. And please feel free to also reflect on Paco's insights as you tell us about how Chinese investments unfold in Pakistan.
Thank you, Arya. Thank you, CIPE, for inviting me to this conversation. One thing that stands out is that unlike criticism and some level of transparency about documents, about the process in the Philippines, in Pakistan, there's been no discussion about Chinese investments. And if you read any Pakistani website, Pakistani government spokesman statement about the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the OBOR or BRI, they're gushing. There's almost a reverence towards the Chinese for thanking them for coming to Pakistan to invest in some projects. So the CPEC originally started with $64 billion promises of China developing infrastructure, soft and hard infrastructure in Pakistan over a long-term period. But much of the information, much of the planned investments have been the details of those have been hidden from view. You can find Government of Pakistan websites where some where some information is available, but it's not easy to have access to. So you have to look through things and find what's happening. So this started in 2015. The CPEC project started then. And in the first phase, so there are 3 phases to this. The first phase was initially building some electricity generating projects. And that went very quickly in the first few years, 2015 to 2017 and 18. So there were a large number of very expensive Chinese power projects which came online. And Pakistan had a very severe electricity problem shortage, which was met through the Chinese projects. Costly, but nevertheless, it provided electricity widely. A couple of other very important projects was a port being built by the Chinese, near the Persian Gulf, a Gwadar port. Work started on that, stopped, slowed, and so on and so forth. And then literally a corridor, a road being built from Gwadar, the south of Pakistan, all the way to China through the Silk Road, the old Silk Road, and the physical Silk Road into China, right across Pakistan. So when the Chinese came with their gifts to Pakistan, there was great enthusiasm. The government at that time was desperate for financial resources from abroad. So they welcomed the government, they welcomed the Chinese, they welcomed all their projects, and they went out of their way to support any initiative which the Chinese felt was important. And they started building these projects, largely power generation, because there was a very strong need for that, and then other projects as well. The government at that time changed in 2018. And what's happened since then is that the Chinese have turned a bit cool, if not cold, towards the CPEC projects in Pakistan. You hear almost no public questioning, leave alone criticism, or the other way around. You hear no criticism, no questioning about Chinese investments in Pakistan, except for some economists who argue that the Pakistan government has completely sold Pakistan away to the Chinese because most of these projects are being built in Pakistan are being made available on commercial loans, not even on concessionary loans. So there's a fear that uh, Pakistan's debt to China is going to increase multiple times, and Pakistan will be caught in a very severe debt trap both. So there's been fear of that, but there's been very little. There's been very clear consensus amongst all political parties that CPEC, China's efforts have to be supported, protected. The military in Pakistan, which plays a very strong role in its politics and geopolitics, is a key beneficiary of CPEC. They claim that they're going to defend CPEC. So CPEC has become a nationalist project for Pakistan and for the governments in power, and also the opposition. So you find a few economists, a few activists who question CPEC in different parts of Pakistan, who say that they're not enough benefit has been given to Pakistan, but that's like 1 out of 1,000 perhaps, or million. A very large number of people feel that CPEC is very good for Pakistan. The government has sold it very well or continues to sell it. So a country which is highly dependent on aid looks at CPEC as a game changer. That's the term that's been used a great deal throughout the last few years, that this is a game changer. There are those in Pakistan who say that the game is already over because the Chinese have come and sort of in some ways replaced American influence, American capital, and influence from other countries. So that's where we are today. And the CPEC process of building infrastructure has slowed down, but it's still, if not on the front page, in all newspapers, you always hear of some CPEC project, some meeting. You hear more about meetings than about projects being undertaken. So the first phase has come to a halt, an end. The second phase, where different types of activities take place, has been slowed down. So those who defend CPEC say it hasn't come to an end, it hasn't slowed down. It's just that a second phase has taken place, which means that the strategy, the speed, and the focus is going to change. So that's what I had to say at this point, and then we can I can join the conversation. I can ask questions later. Arya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zedi, for this complimentary set of insights on Pakistan. Your remarks demonstrate quite well the rationale behind putting Pakistan and Philippines in one sentence or in one event that discusses Chinese investments in large-scale infrastructure. The contrast that is quite visible between the two countries, and which puts the two countries on the two opposite sides of the spectrum, is how perspectives are positioned vis-a-vis Chinese investment in these two countries. There are a few questions that I also have for you, and why don't we begin the Q&A session? As I mentioned earlier, our participants can use the Q&A feature. They should have access to that to ask their questions. But I will begin with a question, and I will go back to Paco. Paco, if I may come back to you and ask about your thoughts on the recommendations that you may have for closing governance loopholes that are highlighted in your case studies.
Sure thing. Thanks, Arya. Yeah, when it comes to recommendations, the case studies had a few, but one that I did want to highlight during this particular event is the need to amplify and raise further awareness for the patterns and the issues and controversies, especially as the current administration draws near the end of its term and the next elections. When we talk about governance, especially here in the Philippines, we're often described as a very populist, very reactive country. And that's why I think that really amplifying and raising awareness through civil society groups, through civic engagement, is one of the key things that is lacking, or that could really help address some of these governance gaps that we've been seeing when it comes to Chinese investments. And I think even the news articles that I had shown earlier, these are perhaps good examples of this, because the reason that these conversations are being had and the reason that these narratives are coming out through the media is because civil society groups, think tanks like Strat-based ADR Institute continue to discuss and raise awareness for how important these issues are. So I think, if there was one thing that, one recommendation that I wanted to highlight, it would be that.
Thank you, Paco. Dr. Zedi, if I can come back to you, Paco talked about governance gaps and decision-making dynamics. What is the process of decision-making about these projects in Pakistan, given how cordial a relation the two countries of Pakistan and China are, and given the consensus that you talked about that there is between political parties, that the CPEC should be supported and protected and promoted? How consultative is the process, and do civil society and private sector have the opportunity to be involved in the process at all?
So this is a Chinese project out and out. CPEC is a China-driven initiative, effort, project, need, and Pakistan. I wrote about this some time ago, that Pakistan is just the territory through which they run. I mean, in other words, if they want to get to Gwadar, which is the port and the south of Pakistan, because that allows easy access to the oil world of the Middle East. So, it just happened that Pakistan was on the way and China needed to get there. So that gives you almost, it's like walking all over Pakistan, literally in some ways, which gives you a sense of how easy it is for the Chinese to determine what CPEC and BRI in Pakistan is going to be. So there's from what emerges in the public arena, there's very little pushback from the Pakistani government about negotiations. I think that word is seldom used. It's the Chinese wanted this and the Pakistanis agreed. It's almost literally agreeing to whatever China wanted. I mean, for example, there's a very interesting parallel where when the Chinese wanted to undertake a project in Bangladesh, the Bangladeshi government said, well, this has environmental consequences which are going to be very severe. And that's why Bangladesh said that they can't agree to that project unless China made some changes. I've never heard any government official question Chinese authority in any regard. I mean, not just CPEC, but CPEC because it brings in a lot of money and it's got a lot of clout and things like that, and the hope or potential for investment. So the very long and short answer to your question is this: there's very little discussion which comes out in the public. The government does claim that they have thought about, discussed, spoken to the Chinese, but I think pretty much the Chinese get whatever they want, whatever terms they want, and they rule.
Thank you, Dr. Zedi. There's a question that has come from the participants, Paco, for you, and it perfectly segues from Dr. Zedi's discussion about almost no interactions from non-governmental organizations with how the decisions are made on this project. But in the case of Philippines, how can civil society and other forces in society engage with large-scale projects, large-scale infrastructure projects, to safeguard democratic institutions and protect people's interests and rights? What are opportunities to do that in the Philippines, Paco?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Arya. So definitely, I think I touched on it a bit earlier when I mentioned, how just continuing the discussion, may it be through, think tanks writing policy papers, or by citizen groups organizing these virtual discussions like we're having now, to talk about, the governance risks faced by corrosive capital. I think these are all effective ways that civil society groups and stakeholders are able to participate and somehow contribute to the discourse and shape how government approaches its dealings with China and Chinese investments. I think another key way that that civil society groups are able to participate in this discussion, again, is through social media. I just wanted to cite one example. For instance, I talked about earlier Dito Telecommunity, right? Being this new telecommunications firm. And one of the things, as it was setting up its cell sites, people found out that they were setting up cell sites in military camps around the country. And there's this big online movement, and everybody was complaining, and this forced the Secretary of National Defense to actually speak out and say, okay, we'll stop allowing Dito Telecommunity to set up these cell sites in military camps. Obviously, the concern was that there's surveillance and how that might present some sort of security risk being so close to our military facilities. But of course, the part that goes unnoticed there is that the incumbent telecommunications firms actually have been practicing that same setup for years, where they too set up telecommunication towers within military camps. But because of the backlash from citizens online, it forced policymakers, in this case the Secretary of National Defense, to make a policy change. And maybe just as a last example, I think again I had mentioned earlier the pending bill on the Public Services Act in the Senate. Again, we have the bill is pending with the Committee on Public Services, which is headed by a very active senator, Senator Grace Poe, and I think that is yet another venue where citizens or civil society groups and stakeholders are able to directly engage with policymakers when it comes to these committee hearings and these discussions that we have on what the concerns are with pending bills. So I think across the spectrum of ways of public participation, there are options from online to directly in the legislative process for citizen groups to participate.
Thank you so much, Paco. There is one question from CIPE's Regional Director for Asia, John Morrell, and the question is for Dr. Zaidi. I will read the question, Dr. Zaidi. How does Pakistani law deal with the secrecy of Chinese loans? It's common practice for China to include ironclad non-disclosure requirements in its credit facilities, which preclude the loan recipient, that is the Pakistani government, from disclosing the terms of the credit facilities. Pakistan has a right to information law, so if a Pakistani citizen requests information about a loan from China, would that request be honored? Dr. Zaidi.
Yes, there is a right to information law, but there's also a very vibrant media, which has been suffocated by the government in the last few months. There have been disappearances of journalists. They've been picked up, disappeared. The press has been strangulated. So this is part of Arya's question earlier about civil society. So I think generally overall, there's a very positive perception of the Chinese. They are our closest friends, deeper than the deepest sea, higher than the highest Himalayas and stuff like that. With these, so there is even amongst the people, even say the civil society, there's a general acceptance of the Chinese. So so to respond to your second question, that I'm not sure about the legal status of Chinese investments over CPEC with Pakistan. I haven't heard anybody talk about. I mean, no one's asked the question that you just asked, whether we could look at the loan sort of the agreement. I know in Parliament at times, whenever it works, members of the opposition do ask the ruling party, whichever party it happens to be, okay, can you tell us a little bit more about the Chinese loans? Then we hear that, okay, they are our closest allies, our best friends, our saviors, so we don't ask such questions, and they're glossed over. So it's a one-sided story. So that's the problem. So if a citizen were to ask about the details, we'll be told to go and look at the website, which has some details, but not enough. And we really don't know what the nature of the legal aspects about, the Chinese presence, literally physical presence, the rules, the amount of money they can repatriate, things like that. It's improbable that we'll get information. And I don't think anybody is going to be foolish enough to ask.
Thank you, Dr. Zedi, and thank you, John, for the question. If I can dig a little deeper on this, Dr. Zedi, with you, since there is very little discussion going on, since most people are discouraged from asking questions. As a political economist, what considerations do you think should the decision makers in Pakistan, whatever level of decision-making authority they have vis-a-vis CPEC projects, what considerations should they factor in as they negotiate or discuss these projects?
So I think so we have to, as I mentioned before, this is sort of the underlying trend to what I'm saying, that there's an over enthusiastic acceptance of Chinese, and CPEC. No questions asked. There are people here and there who say, okay, what is this worth? What's going to happen? How much is it going to cost? Things like that. Individuals, experts, economists, and some political activists. So you can look at any loan, for example. You can look at the IMF loan, which is more public. The IMF is far more open than the Chinese government is. So you can find full descriptions of the terms of their loan on their website, which the opposition party, whoever they are, raises questions in Parliament and says, why have we sold Pakistan to the IMF? Why have we agreed to such severe conditions? You never hear that about the Chinese loan. So they have there's no level playing field when it comes to the Chinese. I mean, they literally stomp over, walk over the Pakistani officials, dignitaries, and Pakistan, and they decide what they want to do. So you don't hear very even benign questions like, oh, how much money are we getting? Do we have to pay this back, or is this a loan, or is this a grant? That's the first thing you would ask when somebody says, okay, here's $10 billion. You're given confusing answers. You're never given a clear answer. When it comes to the IMF, when it comes to other countries, you get a very clear, precise agreement which takes place between Pakistan. But with China, no. So it's that China is way above all other countries when it comes to Pakistan, whether it's the military, whether it's the political scene, or whether it's the economic actors. So they're so protected, so revered, that such questions are not asked. It's to say, I mean, mildly, I say it's impolite, but it's more than that.
Thank you, Dr. Zedi. I'm wondering, Paco, if you can chime in here, and you've worked on these case studies. if you can tell us about how are the case studies informing civil society perceptions, or how are they enabling them to engage with these DSR-funded projects? The reason why I'm asking that is having information is the first step in being able to do anything about it, in praising the project, in criticizing it, and helping it improve, in engaging with it in any capacity. So the fact that you've worked on these case studies, how do you think they are informing the considerations and options that civil society in the Philippines has in order to make these projects and investments more accountable and transparent?
Sure. Oh, thanks for the question. That's a good one. So you're right. Over the course of conducting these case studies, a large part of the BRI Monitor project has also been to engage with different civil society groups and in a way try to build capacity and broaden their understanding of the different risks that these sort of investments may have for the Filipino people. And you're right, information is a very important resource. It's the first resource that you would need just to start on just understanding the issues. Before I dive into that a bit more, though, I did want to point out that we've been talking a lot about the Philippines and how active our civil society is, especially compared to Pakistan, perhaps, as Dr. Zaidi has pointed out. And I think what's different here in the Philippines is actually it's while there may be civil society voices talking about some of these risks, it's the government itself that perhaps is staying a little bit quiet when it comes to these risks. With the president, our president himself, really practicing this what we call appeasement policy when it comes to China. So I think given that the government, if these groups were to rely on government alone for information, perhaps it wouldn't be that widely available. And just to bring it back now to the real question that you asked me, and that's why I think that definitely that these sort of case studies and these sort of activities and discussions, play a pivotal role in improving the capacity of civil society groups to understand the nuance of the different arguments and the different risks. And I've seen this over the past few months, how it's really sharpened their own advocacies and really allowed these different groups, usually multi-sectoral groups from economic, not just political groups, but consumer groups as well, and environmental groups, for example, to really relate the risks of these projects to their own advocacies, to their own constituents. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you, Paco. But if I can ask about another dynamic of how these case studies may enable advocates in the Philippines, do you think it will help them advocate in informed candidates' platforms for the upcoming election in the Philippines? Do you think it will have an impact in orienting the dynamics of those conversations?
Sure. I think the case studies and the BRI Monitor is a start, right? It's a good start. It's a good foundation to continue this discussion on these risks and on the different issues that Chinese investments face in the Philippines. And definitely, given this as this foundation, civil society groups can continue the discussions that are ongoing now when it comes to these concerns and to this mistrust that we have and these concerns with national security and these governance gaps. And I can already see it that we're at this point 7 months away from the election, 6 months away from the elections, that this will be an issue that will be discussed as we talk, in terms of election issues. Not just because civil society is talking about it, but I think media as well has that interest in talking about Chinese investments and the impact they have on the Philippines.
Thank you, Paco. Dr. Zedi, there's a question from one of the participants that digs a little deeper into your remarks on perceptions about these projects in Pakistan. And the question basically asks if you can tell us a little bit more about perceptions across sectors, that is civil society, private sector, and public sector. Is it the same across three branches of government? You mentioned political parties, I know, but this particular question wants to know if across three branches of government, the perceptions remain the same, and also across different regions or different provinces in Pakistan. Is there a difference of opinion anywhere that's witnessed or that's visible?
It's a good question. So one segment of society, call it the private sector, they've been a bit upset at the preference given to Chinese investments over local investments. Private sector investors, those who, for example, there are certain zones, economic zones, which have been set up where Chinese investment is welcomed and given a lot of rebates and tax concessions, but Pakistani investors are not given the same. So they feel, the private sector, they feel that this is an unfair, as it is, you can't compete against the Chinese, but this is giving them another unfair advantage over Pakistani investors. I think that's true, that is the case. And the second one is about the regions which you ask. And I mean, for example, Gwadar port is in Balochistan, which is one of the 4 provinces of Pakistan, which has had a lot of political and other sort of trouble in the last 30 or 40 years, and continues to have certain political movements which question the authority of the state, which question the influence of other provinces in Balochistan. So that's even without CIPEC. So what CIPEC and what Chinese investment has done is that it's destabilized and unstable. It's further destabilized an unstable position. There are people in Balochistan who will benefit, who have benefited, but there is resentment or concern that Balochistan itself, the people of Balochistan, are not benefiting substantially by Chinese investments, and other parts of Pakistan, Punjab, for example, the other provinces, they are. So this is an ongoing complaint from Balochistan, from a section of Baloch political actors and other actors, that they're not benefiting enough from investments across Pakistan, and CIPEC only makes things worse. It adds to the imbalance in the province.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zedi. We have a few more questions also in the Q&A section, but our time is up. Dr. Zedi, Paco, thank you so much for joining us today and for the time you took to prepare and share information and insights with our participants, and for providing information about a set of contrasting perspectives. Interestingly, what connects Pakistan and Philippines in this case is as I mentioned, their position on the opposing sides of the spectrum when it comes to perceptions of the impact of these investments and the changes that they introduce in people's lives. We certainly hope to come back to this conversation, but for now, thank you to our panelists and thank you to our participants, and also thank you for your questions. For those of you interested in joining the next event of this series, we will see you on December 2nd with a discussion on case studies developed by CIPE in ideas in Malaysia. But till then, stay safe, and if you're celebrating, have a happy and safe Thanksgiving. Thank you, everyone.